The wind howled like a living thing. It screamed across the endless white, clawing at Kaylin Ward's coat with frozen fingers, biting into every seam and weakness. The storm had no shape, no mercy, only movement. It blurred the sky and the ground into one colorless void. There were no landmarks here, no sound beyond the howl, just an ocean of snow and the crushing weight of silence. Kaylin trudged forward, head low, breath short. His goggles were frosted over, every step heavier than the last. Snowflakes as sharp as glass sliced across his cheeks. His gloves were soaked, boots half buried in drifts that came up to his knees. But he kept moving. He had seen something. A shape. Not more than a flicker of shadow in the storm. At first he thought it was a hallucination. Cold did that. Played with your eyes. Pulled ghosts out of the wind. But then he saw it again, still. Curled against a jagged outcrop of black stone. Someone was out there. He broke into a staggered run. Each breath burned in his lungs. Ice crept up his collar. His backpack pulled at his shoulders like a weight that wanted him buried. But he didn't stop. Not until he reached her. The figure lay crumpled against the rock, half covered in snow. She was small, barely more than a silhouette at first, curled tightly like a fallen bird. Her skin, what little showed, was pale blue, tinged with a sickly gray. Her clothes were shredded, soaked, and paper-thin, offering no warmth. Long silver hair clung to her face in icy strands. Her lips trembled. Her eyes, glassy and wide, fluttered open. She wasn't human. Kaylin froze for half a breath. Then he knelt beside her, not hesitating. Alien or not, she was dying. "Hey," he said, his voice raw from the cold. "Can you hear me? You're going to be okay." She flinched at the sound, trying to pull away, but she was too weak. Her fingers barely moved. Kaylin stripped off his heavy coat without thinking, ignoring the rush of cold that hit his chest. He wrapped it around her small frame, tucking it tight, shielding her from the wind. She gasped, not in pain, not in fear, in disbelief. Her hands clutched the coat as if it were the last solid thing in the world. Her shoulders shook. Tears streamed down her cheeks silently, freezing as they fell. She buried her face into the warmth, hiding, but Kaylin saw everything. The desperation, the gratitude, the heartbreak. He looked around. The storm was getting worse. Snow piled fast around their knees. If they stayed out here, they'd both vanish under the white. He leaned down, slipping his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, fragile. Bones, and frost, and fear. "We're getting out of here," he said. "Hold on." She didn't resist. The walk back was a nightmare, every step a battle. The storm had erased his footprints. Every direction looked the same. But Kaylin had mapped this route in his mind. He trusted his memory, trusted the compass clipped to his belt. Most of all, he trusted his will. The part of him that had always refused to die quietly. The alien girl, whoever she was, pressed her face against his chest. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just held on, as if letting go meant disappearing forever. Kaylin tightened his grip. Snow slammed against his face. Ice found its way into his boots. His legs burned with exhaustion. His arms ached. But he didn't stop. Not until he saw it. A narrow split between two boulders, hidden by drift and shadow. The mouth of the cave. He stumbled inside, knees hitting rock. The wind howled behind them, but inside it was darker, warmer, quiet. He lowered her gently onto the furs he had laid there days ago. She whimpered softly, the sound barely more than breath. Kaylin pulled out a thermal blanket. He wrapped her tight, then lit the emergency fire, sticks soaked in fuel that burned hot even in thin air. The flame caught. It was small, but enough. He turned to her. She lay curled, his jacket still wrapped around her like armor. Her eyes followed the flame. Wide. Fearful. Disbelieving. Kaylin crouched beside her and held out a metal cup. "Drink," he said gently. She reached with trembling hands. Sipped. The warm liquid brought a flicker of color to her cheeks. Kalen smiled. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise." Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something fragile had begun to thaw. Not just her skin, but the silence between them. And whatever it was, whatever chased her across this frozen world, it had not expected someone like Kalen, and it certainly had not expected him to care. The storm still screamed beyond the stone walls of the cave, but inside, the world had shrunk to the flicker of a single flame and the sound of shallow breathing. Kalen sat cross-legged near the fire, watching her, the alien girl, wrapped tightly in his jacket and the thermal blanket. Her body trembled, but the color was returning to her face slowly, cautiously, like a tide testing unfamiliar shore. She hadn't said a word since drinking from the metal cup. Her wide eyes followed every movement Kalen made. Not in curiosity, in defense, like a creature waiting for pain. He didn't blame her. Whatever had chased her into the blizzard had left more than bruises. It had hollowed out something deeper. Kalen reached into his pack and pulled out a second ration cube. He unwrapped it, broke off half, and placed the smaller piece beside her. She didn't move. He didn't press. Trust didn't bloom in a day. Especially not here. Especially not now. He leaned back against the cave wall, letting out a slow breath. The stone was cold through his shirt. His coat, now hers, was still damp from snow. His body ached, his fingers still numb, but his mind couldn't stop racing. Who was she? What had she been running from? What kind of world had dropped her into his path, and why did she look like someone built of light and sorrow? Outside, the storm began to shift, the wind no longer screaming but whimpering, like a beast too tired to snarl. The cave dimmed, shadows from the flame dancing on the walls like ghosts. He decided to try. "My name's Kalen," he said slowly, tapping his chest. "Kalen." She watched him, silent. He repeated it, softer this time, adding a small smile. "Kalen." For a moment, nothing. Then, a hand moved. Trembling fingers lifted from beneath the blanket and pointed toward herself. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "Virelia." Kalen's smile widened. "Virelia," he echoed gently. Her lips quivered. Not quite a smile, but not fear either. "Progress." He nodded once, grateful for the silence between them. It was no longer empty. It was beginning to mean something. He reached for his glove and removed it. Then he dipped a finger into the ash near the fire and began drawing on the stone floor. A circle, a mountain, a stick figure. He pointed to himself, then the figure. "Crashed here. Survivor." She tilted her head, eyes flicking between the drawing and him. Slowly, she reached for a small stick and scratched her own symbols next to his. A jagged arc, a cluster of dots, a shape that looked like an eye. Kalen leaned in. She pointed at the arc, then mimed running. Then pointed at the eye, then at herself, running from them. Whoever they were. Kalen felt a weight settle deeper in his gut. He nodded once, showing her he understood. He reached over and placed another small piece of dried fruit near her hands. A gesture. Simple. Human. She hesitated. Then, with slow fingers, picked it up and held it to her mouth. She didn't eat it yet. She looked at him. He nodded again. Encouraging. She took a bite. Her eyes fluttered closed. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a step. They sat like that for a while. No more symbols, no more words. Just the crackle of the fire, the hush of snow against stone, and the quiet company of two souls who had no business surviving this long. Kalen shifted and added a few more sticks to the flame. It flared slightly, sending a warm breath through the cave. The shadows moved again. Then Virelia made a sound. Barely audible. A whisper in her own language. Kalen didn't understand, but he recognized the tone. It was a thank you. He looked at her, really looked, and saw that her shoulders had relaxed just a little. Her fingers had stopped clenching the blanket so tightly. Her eyes no longer darted toward the cave entrance every 5 seconds. He nodded once more. "You're safe," he said again. And even though she didn't know the words, she seemed to believe him. Outside, the wind softened into a slow, mournful hum. Inside, the fire burned steady. And in that quiet, two strangers began to learn a language older than words. One made of heat, breath, stillness, and trust. Just beginning to grow. The storm outside had not died. It had only changed. Its howls had dulled into low, lingering moans, like the deep sighs of something vast moving beneath the ice. Kalen sat near the entrance of the cave, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the swirling white beyond. The fire behind him still crackled low, casting a soft glow across the stone. But the warmth no longer brought comfort. Not with what he felt pressing in from the dark. Virelia was awake now. She sat closer to the wall, knees drawn to her chest, his jacket wrapped tightly around her body. She had not spoken again, but Kalen saw it in her eyes. The fear had returned. Every sound made her flinch. Every shift of snow outside made her glance toward the entrance. She was not afraid of the cold. She was afraid of something else. Kalen didn't ask. He didn't need to. He could feel it too. The air had changed, too quiet, too heavy, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Then came the first sound. A scrape. Faint. Far away. Metal against stone or claw against ice. Kalen couldn't tell. But Virelia's head snapped toward it instantly, eyes wide, shoulders trembling. Kalen stood and moved slowly toward the entrance, pressing his back against the cold wall. He held his rifle tight, finger close to the trigger. The cave mouth framed a swirling wall of snow, visibility down to a few meters at best. Nothing moved, but something was there. Another scrape, closer now, followed by silence. Then a low growl, not animal, not wind. Something that meant harm. Kalen motioned to Virelia with one hand. Stay low, stay quiet. She nodded, her hands clutched tight around the blanket. Her breath came fast, shallow. The fire's glow flickered against the stone, shadows moving like nervous fingers. Kalen peeked outside. Still nothing, but his instincts screamed. He moved back inside and tossed a handful of snow onto the fire, dimming its light to a low ember. Darkness crawled in, but at least the smoke wouldn't betray their position. That was when he saw the shape. A figure moved just beyond the wall of white. It limped strangely, hunched over, head low. Then another appeared beside it. Two. Maybe more. Kalen cursed silently. They were not wandering, they were searching. The slow way they moved. The way they sniffed the air. The way they paused just near the mouth of the cave, testing something. They weren't hunting by sight. They were tracking by scent. Virelia let out a soft whimper, barely audible. But it was enough. One of the figures outside stopped, turned, sniffed, and roared. A guttural sound that tore through the night like a blade. Kalen didn't wait. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot lit up the cave with a single flash. The creature howled and flew back into the snow. The second one lunged. Kalen barely dodged. The beast slammed into the stone, claws raking sparks into the rock. Kalen rolled, aimed, fired again. The shot glanced off the creature's shoulder. It shrieked and vanished into the storm. Kalen scrambled toward the entrance, grabbed a heavy rock, and slammed it down to partially block the gap. Not perfect, but better than nothing. His heart hammered. Virelia was curled against the far wall, sobbing silently, her face pale, eyes wide. Kalen moved to her and crouched low. It's okay, he lied. We're okay. But they both knew they weren't. He rebuilt the fire low, just enough to keep the cold from stealing them in their sleep. The rest of the night passed in silence. Neither of them slept. Virelia sat close to the flame, eyes unfocused, staring into it as if it could erase whatever memory haunted her. Kalen sat with his rifle in his lap, every muscle tight, every sound outside dragging his mind to the edge. There was no question anymore. Those things weren't wild animals. They were looking for her. And now they knew she wasn't alone. The storm outside raged. Inside, only silence. But between the crackle of flame and the slow rise and fall of Virelia's breath, Kaelin made a decision. Whatever hunted her, whatever she was, he would not hand her over. Not while he could still stand. Not while he could still breathe. Not while she still clutched his coat like it meant life itself. Something was coming, but they would face it together. The cave was a fortress of shadows now. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting faint red halos on the walls like silent warnings. Outside, the storm had returned with sharpened teeth, slamming snow and ice against the stone like fists trying to break in. Kaelin sat upright, his rifle cradled in his arms, eyes fixed on the entrance. Every few seconds, his gaze drifted to the girl sitting in the corner. Virelia. She hadn't spoken in hours, but Kaelin could see her mind racing behind those wide, violet eyes. She was no longer shivering from the cold. She was frozen by fear. Kaelin shifted slightly, his back aching from hours of tension. He reached for the flask of warm water near the fire, poured a small amount into the cup, and slid it toward her without a word. She blinked, hesitated, then slowly took the cup, her fingers brushing against his glove. For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not language, not thought, just shared exhaustion. Kaelin exhaled slowly. He tapped his chest again. Kaelin, he repeated softly. She nodded. Then, after a pause, she pointed at herself again. Virelia. But this time, her voice cracked on the last syllable, as if even saying the name cost her something. Kaelin's brow furrowed. He leaned closer. Virelia, he said again, gently. Then he tilted his head, inviting more. She looked away, her hands tightened around the cup. And then, without warning, she spoke. Not in English, not even in anything Kaelin could understand, but in something deeper. Her voice flowed in a soft, musical language full of curves and emotion. A language shaped by stars and ruins. She spoke fast, and Kaelin didn't try to interrupt. He simply listened. Her eyes were distant, her voice trembled. When she stopped, the cave was silent again. Kaelin waited. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and drew a line in the ash beside the fire. He pointed to her, then to the entrance. Them, he said. Virelia nodded slowly. Kaelin made a claw with his hand, growled softly, then pointed to the marks still visible on the cave wall, where the creature had tried to break in. She nodded again. Then she reached forward and drew a symbol in the ash. It looked like a tree, cracked in two, bleeding from the middle. She pointed to it. Her expression darkened. Kaelin watched closely. Your home? She looked down, then nodded once. He sat back, the realization sinking in. She wasn't just a lost traveler. She was running from something that had destroyed her home. He looked at her again. At the bruises on her arms. The way she flinched at every noise. The way she wore fear like a second skin. Something had broken her world, and now it hunted her through the snow. Kaelin felt a slow burn rise in his chest. Not fear. Anger. Whoever had sent those things, whoever had chased her into the blizzard, had done so expecting no one would stop to help. He looked at her, and this time, when he spoke, his voice was stronger. You're not alone anymore. She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone made her eyes fill with tears. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Kaelin didn't move. He didn't reach out. But he stayed there, guarding, watching, listening. Outside, something scratched at the snow again. A soft, patient scrape. Kaelin lifted the rifle slightly, listened, waited. The scratching faded. They were still out there, but so was he. And if they wanted her, they would have to come through him. Inside the cave, the silence wrapped around them again. Not empty, not cold, but full of something new, a beginning. And outside, in the howling dark, the monsters waited for the wrong moment to strike. They didn't know yet. This girl was no longer prey. Not with Kaelin beside her. Not anymore. The storm outside had faded into a strange stillness, the kind that made every sound louder, every breath sharper. Kaelin paced the narrow cave, boots crunching softly over stone. His rifle never left his side. He hadn't slept, not after what they had seen. Not after the way those things had moved, sniffed, tested their cave like wolves circling a fire. Virelia lay curled near the dying embers, wrapped in his jacket and blanket, her face pale, hair tangled like strands of frost. She hadn't spoken since last night, but he could feel it. Something inside her had changed, hardened. Kaelin knelt beside her, brushing some ice crystals from her shoulder. "We can't stay," he whispered. "They'll come back, and next time they won't wait." Her eyes opened slowly, cloudy with fatigue, but still alert. She didn't answer, just looked at him. The message was clear. "I know." Kaelin packed quickly. Rations, water purifier, fire starter, extra rounds. He placed the last of the nutrient paste into her hand and gently helped her stand. She staggered but nodded that she was ready. He wrapped his arm under hers for support. "We move together," he said. And they stepped back into the white. The cold hit them like knives. The snow was deeper now, crusted with ice. The wind didn't scream anymore. It whispered, sharp and low, like something unseen watching from behind the drifts. Kaelin leaned into the wind, each step a test of will. Virelia clung to him weakly, her body still too fragile. The direction didn't matter much, anywhere but here. Away from the cave, away from where they had been found. Hours passed, maybe more. The world was a blur of gray and white. Kaelin's legs ached, his lips cracked. His mind drifted toward the edge of unconsciousness. Only Virelia's breath against his chest kept him focused. She needed him. That was enough. Then the ground shifted. It wasn't a sound, more a feeling, a low vibration beneath the snow. Kaelin froze. Another tremor. Then the ice cracked. "No," he breathed. But it was too late. The ground beneath them gave way. A crack, a roar, the sudden rush of gravity. He shouted, pulling Virelia close, shielding her with his body. They fell through snow, through air, through darkness, and landed hard in a bed of cold powder. Kaelin groaned, pain shooting through his side. He rolled over, coughing, checking Virelia first. She was unconscious but breathing. Relief hit him like warmth. He sat up slowly and stared. They were inside a cavern. No, something bigger, a vast hollow space beneath the ice. Light filtered through cracks far above, casting blue shadows over the snow-covered floor. And stretching out before him, a city. Ruins, frozen in time. Towering structures of glassy stone and crystal jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Arches half buried in snow, bridges connecting buildings suspended in the air by massive roots of ice. Carvings lined every surface, etched symbols pulsing faintly in the cold. Kaelin's breath caught. He stood slowly, scanning the silent world around him. It was ancient, alien, beautiful. He turned as Virelia stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, then widened. She gasped, not in fear, in recognition. Her voice cracked. "No." She tried to sit up, her hand reaching toward the tallest tower. Her fingers trembled as if reaching for something already lost. Kaelin steadied her. "You know this place?" Her voice was small. "My people built it." Kaelin stared at her. She nodded weakly. "Before the wars, before the burning skies. This was our heart, before it fell." They sat in silence, staring at the buried past. A lost city beneath the ice. A tomb of memory. Then Kaelin saw movement. Not from above. From the shadows between the towers. A figure. Tall, cloaked. Watching. He grabbed his rifle, eyes narrowing. Virelia didn't flinch. Instead, her hand gripped his arm. "Wait," she whispered. The figure stepped forward, slowly, arms raised, empty hands. Kaelin didn't lower the weapon. "Who is that?" Virelia stared, eyes wide. A guardian, she said. One of the old protectors. The figure stopped 10 paces away, his face hidden beneath a hood of woven light, his presence ancient. Not hostile, but powerful. Virelia's voice trembled. He doesn't trust you. Kaylin's heart pounded. Because I'm human. She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. The guardian spoke then, in a language neither of them had heard in 1,000 years. Deep, melodic, like wind over stone. Virelia listened. Her breath hitched. Then she turned to Kaylin. He says we can leave. There's a path. But only if I go alone. Kaylin froze. What? Her lips trembled. He says, you've done enough. The storm outside had tested his strength. But this tested his soul. He looked at her. The alien girl who had nearly died in his arms, who had hidden her name behind silence, who had whispered thanks through tears, who had saved him just by being alive. He shook his head. No, he said. If you go, I go. Virelia gasped. Kaylin! The guardian's voice rose again, sharper now, a warning. Kaylin didn't care. He took her hand. I'm not leaving you. I made a promise. And in that frozen breath of silence, something shifted. The guardian studied them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his hood. A scarred, noble face. Eyes filled with ancient sorrow. And then he bowed. A silent answer. He would lead them both. And from the heart of the frozen city, a new path opened. Not just a tunnel through the ice, but a choice. A future. A war yet to come. They moved beneath the earth like whispers between sleeping giants. The guardian led them through the city's heart, down winding tunnels and over crumbled bridges dusted with frost. Above them, towering towers of ancient stone loomed like frozen gods. The air was thick, not with cold, but with memory. Kaylin could feel it in his chest. Each step felt heavier, each silence louder. Virelia walked beside him now, no longer clinging to his jacket, no longer shrinking from shadows. Her silver hair flowed like silk behind her, eyes sharp, back straight. Her strength was returning, slowly but undeniably. She no longer looked like the girl he had found dying in the snow. She looked like someone who once belonged to a lost throne. Kaylin watched her quietly. The guardian watched him. They reached a vast chamber beneath the central spire, an open space ringed with broken statues. In the center stood a platform made of interlocking crystal, pulsing faintly with blue light. The guardian stopped and turned. He spoke in his ancient tongue. Low, commanding. Virelia listened, then translated softly. He says this is where the oath must be made. Kaylin frowned. What oath? Her eyes shimmered. To protect me, not just from the storm, from what comes next. If you take it, there's no turning back. Kaylin didn't hesitate. I already did that, the day I wrapped my coat around you. The guardian stepped forward, holding out a small object. A band made of twisted metal and light. Old tech, alien and sacred. Kaylin took it. It pulsed once against his skin. Cold at first, then warm. Then, something else, like it knew him. He slid it onto his wrist. The platform lit up. Virelia gasped. The chamber responded. Ancient glyphs ignited along the walls. The statues shuddered. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through their bones. Suddenly, from above, a screech split the stillness. Kaylin spun, rifle raised. From the cracks in the ceiling, shadows poured in. Figures, dozens of them, leapt down from the stone balconies. Clawed, hunched, snarling. Eyes glowing with that same awful hunger. The beasts had followed them. Kaylin didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Virelia, firing in short bursts. The first creature dropped, screeching. The others scattered, moving like smoke through the ruins. The guardian leapt into the fray, his glowing staff slicing arcs of light through the shadows. He moved like liquid steel. Grace and brutality fused together. Kaylin ducked a swipe, rolled, fired again. They never stop, he growled. They can't, Virelia shouted over the chaos. They were made to hunt me. Kaelin turned, saw one of the beasts lunging straight for her, and Dove. They collided midair. He slammed into the creature, landing hard on the icy floor. Claws raked his shoulder, drawing blood. He roared in pain but held tight. Rolled, pinned it, shot it point blank in the chest. It collapsed. But more came. Too many. Virelia's hands lit up with that strange energy again, light blooming from her skin like fire made of memory. She screamed, and a wave of power exploded from her chest, knocking the creatures back. But she collapsed immediately after. Too much. Kaelin scrambled to her side. Stay with me. Her eyes fluttered. The Guardian fought desperately, but the numbers overwhelmed. Then, a new sound, a deep, pulsing rhythm, from the platform. The wristband Kaelin wore had activated something. The entire room began to shift. The creatures paused, confused. Then the floor opened. A shockwave blasted upward. Blue light surged into the air, and from the walls, dormant weapons unfolded. Turrets, sentinels, defense systems long forgotten. They roared to life. The chamber became a battleground. Energy bolts lit the dark. The creatures screamed, torn apart by forgotten technology. Kaelin shielded Virelia's body as dust and smoke filled the air. The Guardian stood tall, staff raised, the light of the city answering him. When it ended, the chamber was scorched and silent. Virelia stirred in his arms, dazed. Kaelin looked down at her, breathing hard. You're not running anymore, he said. She blinked, barely able to nod. He stood, lifting her again. The Guardian approached and placed one hand on Kaelin's shoulder. For the first time, he spoke words Kaelin understood. You are chosen, Kaelin frowned. Chosen for what? The Guardian turned, gesturing to the great doors at the far end of the chamber. Virelia answered. To end what my ancestors began. Kaelin didn't move. Then he nodded. Then let's finish it. The doors opened with a sound like mountains grinding against time. Beyond them lay the final plaza, once a sacred hall, now a frozen grave. The ice cracked beneath Kaelin's boots as he stepped forward, Virelia at his side, the Guardian just behind. The air was different here, heavier. Every breath came slower, every heartbeat louder. At the center of the plaza stood a towering obelisk. Black stone shot through with glowing veins of blue, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat long buried. Around it moved shadows, dozens, maybe more. The creatures had come, not wild now. Organized. Waiting. Kaelin crouched behind a fallen column, eyes scanning the movement. Clawed beasts prowled between the pillars, but now they moved with precision. No longer just monsters. They were soldiers. They know I'm here, Virelia whispered, her voice barely audible. They remember this place, and they remember what I carry. Kaelin looked at her. What do you mean? She met his eyes. I wasn't just born into exile, I was born carrying the last code of the old world. They need me to awaken the heart of this city. They need me to control it, or destroy it. Kaelin's fingers tightened on his rifle. Then they won't get you, not while I'm still breathing. The Guardian stepped forward, staff glowing with a deep, ancient energy. He spoke words that rumbled through the ice and stone. Virelia translated. He says the final seal is here. If we can reach it, the city will awaken. But if they reach it first... Kaelin didn't wait. Then we don't let them. He bolted from cover, rifle blazing. The first creature leapt toward him. He dropped it with 2 shots to the chest. The others roared and charged. The Guardian moved beside him like a blade of light, staff striking down anything in his path. Virelia stood behind them, her hands glowing brighter with each breath. She lifted her palms to the sky, and the storm itself seemed to hesitate. A wave of radiant energy erupted from her, slamming into the front lines of the enemy. But they kept coming. For every beast they dropped, 2 more appeared. Kaelin ducked behind a broken sculpture, breath ragged. Blood ran from a gash across his arm. He checked the magazine, nearly empty. Running low, Virelia screamed. He turned. A creature had gotten through. Twisted, twice the size of the others, with bone blades instead of hands. It grabbed her by the arm, dragging her toward the obelisk. No! Kalen ran. He didn't aim. He didn't think. He threw himself into the beast, knocking it sideways, both of them crashing into the ice. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he fought like fire. Fists, elbows, teeth if he had to. The creature slashed him across the side. He barely felt it. He grabbed a shard of stone from the ground and slammed it into its throat, again and again, until it stopped moving. He rolled off, coughing, blood in his mouth. Virelia crawled to him, her hands glowing. "I can heal you," she said, voice cracking. "No time," Kalen whispered. Behind them, the obelisk began to pulse faster. The remaining creatures stopped fighting. They turned. They ran to the center, surrounding the stone. Virelia stood, swaying. Kalen reached for his rifle. Empty. The Guardian limped to their side, bleeding, eyes grim. "This is it," Virelia whispered. "Either I shut it down, or they turn it into a weapon." Kalen looked at her. "What do you need?" "A little more time," he nodded, then charged. He ran into the center of the plaza, drawing the attention of every beast still standing. He didn't have bullets, just rage. He ducked a claw, grabbed a spear from the ground, and swung it wide. The first creature fell. The second raked his side. He kept moving. He was a storm, a fire in the cold, a man with nothing left to lose. Behind him, Virelia knelt at the base of the obelisk, placing her glowing hands on the stone. Light poured from her fingers into the ancient lines. Symbols ignited one by one, spreading outward in a spiral of blue fire. A creature leapt at her. Kalen tackled it mid-air. They hit the ground hard. He screamed as claws slashed his back. Then the light exploded. A wave of pure energy burst from the obelisk. The creatures howled, their bodies disintegrating into ash and wind. The ground shook. The ice cracked. The plaza split apart. Kalen lay still. Virelia crawled to him, her light flickering. She pressed her hands to his wounds, sobbing. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please." His eyes fluttered. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. The Guardian limped forward. He spoke once, voice filled with something between sorrow and awe. Virelia translated through her tears. "He says you did what none of us could. You gave everything without knowing why. And because of that, the city is safe." Kalen smiled weakly. "Then I guess I finally earned that coat back." Virelia laughed through her tears. And above them, for the first time in 100 years, the storm parted. A single beam of light broke through. Warm. Golden. Pure. The light grew warmer with each passing second. It poured through the shattered dome of the frozen city like liquid gold, touching every stone, every broken tower, every blood-stained memory. Kalen lay still, his back against a fallen slab of crystal, chest rising and falling slowly. His jacket was torn. His face was pale. But he was alive. Virelia sat beside him, her fingers still glowing faintly as they hovered just above his wounds. She was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, her breathing shallow, but she refused to stop. Every spark of energy she had left went into him. Around them, the ancient city pulsed with a new rhythm. Not the cold silence of death, but the low hum of life returning. The obelisk was quiet now, its light soft and steady. No longer a weapon, no longer a trap, just a monument. Kalen opened his eyes, blinking at the brightness above. "You stayed," he whispered. Virelia smiled through tears. "Of course I did." The Guardian approached them slowly, his long cloak trailing behind him like the memory of a forgotten age. He no longer carried his staff like a weapon. He carried it like a banner, a symbol of something restored. He knelt before them and spoke in his tongue. Virelia translated softly. "He says the oath is fulfilled. The bond is complete. You are no longer an outsider. You are of this world now." Kalen tried to sit up, groaning. "Took me long enough." Virelia laughed, a sound soft and cracked, but beautiful in its truth. "You never needed a crown or a title," she said. You gave warmth when I was freezing. That was enough?" They sat together for a long while, letting the quiet settle over them. The guardian rose and walked away, disappearing into the heart of the city. His work was done. Kaylin looked out across the ruins. The snow had begun to melt in patches. Pools of water shimmered in the light, reflecting the broken spires above like a dream rediscovered. Somewhere beneath their feet, machines older than memory had awakened. The city would not be silent again. He turned to Virelia. "What now?" She looked at him, then at the light above. "We rebuild." Kaylin nodded slowly. Together. Days passed, then weeks, and the storm never returned. Kaylin worked beside the survivors who began to return, pale-skinned beings who had hidden in tunnels for generations. He taught them how to patch stone with steel, how to purify water with fire. In return, they taught him the names of stars he had never seen, the meaning of symbols he had once thought were only art. Virelia walked beside him every step, stronger each day. Her glow no longer a shield, but a beacon. She was more than just the last of her kind now. She was the first of something new. One evening, as the sun dipped beyond the rim of the crater, Kaylin stood on a rebuilt terrace and looked out across the shimmering valley. Behind him, children's laughter echoed through the new halls. Smoke rose gently from cook fires. Voices sang in a language he didn't yet speak, but somehow understood. Virelia joined him at the railing. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Together they watched as, for the first time, the sky above them held no storm. Only stars. And hope. What would you have done if you found someone trembling in the snow with nothing but fear in her eyes? Would you have given your jacket, walked into the dark for her, stood your ground when the world said run? Tell us what part of Kaylin's journey stayed with you the most. Drop a comment below and remind someone else that trust, even when broken, can always begin again.